Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the 11th session of Islamic book reviews with myself, Usaama al-Azami, and my colleague at Edinburgh University, Dr. Omar Anchassi. This is a wonderful opportunity for me once a week to ask Omar what he's been reading lately, and we then sort of spend an hour discussing the book. And this week's book is Shahla Haeri's, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, The Unforgettable Queens of Islam, Succession, Authority and Gender. And really makes for a fascinating read. And Omar, inshallah, the typical format that we go through is Omar will basically present the book 5-10 minutes or so, and then we'll launch into a discussion. We welcome sort of audience participation. You can write in particularly YouTube and Facebook, you can write in the chat, and we will see the comments and we'll share those comments and or questions. We'll try and address those in the last 15 minutes or so. But, besides that, we welcome your feedback more generally. And if you are interested in staying in touch with the show, inshallah, please like, follow, or subscribe, depending on whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Omar, inshallah, to give a brief presentation of the book before we launch our discussion. Inshallah.
Yes, thank you, Usaama. This is an important, and I must say, very engagingly written book. It's an absolute pleasure to read. And I think can be enjoyed from people from all kinds of disciplinary perspectives, or even those outside the academy. The author is an anthropologist by training, well-known and well-regarded for her classic book on mut'a in the Iranian context, in particular, Law of Desire. And in this book, she has attempted, kind of given her background as an anthropologist, a kind of ethno-history, she calls it, of 6 prominent female rulers in the history of Islamdom. So the book is, as well as an introduction that broaches some of the broader thematic and theoretical concerns the book asks questions about, and a conclusion that reflects on some of the things we've learned in the course of the book. And the book breaks down into 6 body chapters, each an ethno-history and biography of a particular female Muslim ruler. The book is titled The Unforgettable Queens of Islam, which is an homage to the late Fatima Mernishi's book on the forgotten queens of Islam. And she notes that not all of the figures surveyed in the book are literally queens, beginning with Bilqis of the Quran, or as she is known in extra Quranic accounts, the Queen of Sheba, a ruler in Yemen, or Aksum, even in some reports. I was surprised to find this Aksum in Abyssinia, is the first chapter. And then you have an interesting one on Aisha, who of course was never ruler or claimed to rule, but was involved in various succession disputes, if you like, in the early Islamic community. Then 2 chapters on prominent medieval female rulers, Queen Arwa Sayyidah Hurra of Yemen, and Razia Sultan, the 5th Sultan of the Delhi Sultanate. And finally, rounding out the book, you have 2 chapters on respectively the first prime minister, the first female prime minister in a Muslim majority country, Benazir Bhutto, who was first elected to office in 1988, and the first female head of state, so a president. In Pakistan, you have a president and the prime minister, but in this case, Indonesia's Megawati Soekarno Putri of Indonesia. And each chapter is structured in somewhat similar ways. She's interested in interrogating what are the key obstacles to women's power, what kind of opposition did these individual figures face, and was opposition to their rule construed in religious terms. One of the motifs that one finds throughout the book is engagement with this hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, that people shall not rule, people shall not prosper. لَنْ يُفْلِحَ قَوْمٌ who give their affairs over to women, or who are led whose affairs are led by women. And there is also some engagement with this hadith, specifically in the introduction. And she talks about its context as well. So what happens towards the final years, the twilight years of the Sasanian Empire, and whom is this hadith construed as a reference to Por Docht, or Buran in the Arabic sources, the daughter of Khusro Anushirvan, is it? If I'm not mistaken.
Anushirvan, yeah.
She was involved in this succession struggle. She came to power briefly from 631 to 632. So it's a reign right at the end of the Prophet's life, and although it seems she indicates, this, notwithstanding its brevity, to have been a reasonably successful ruler in the sense that she tried to unite aristocratic and military elites who were riven by factionalism prior to her ascent to the throne, something that continues really after her death. And in some accounts, she even, or under her watch, as it were, the Sasanians scored their only signal victory against Arab Muslim armies at the Battle of the Bridge, but there is controversy about its date. So some would say 632, in which case it happened during her tenure in office, as it were. But more likely, I think it happened in 634. But anyway, so to give some interesting context to this, she engages quite carefully with the secondary literature. Some sources, for instance, those on Razia Sultan, are in Persian primarily, and where the sources in question are in Arabic, she engages where she can with translation. The surprising amount, actually, I was unaware in translation when it comes to, for instance, the life and reign of Queen Arwa. And the subtitle of the book, Succession, Authority and Gender, hopefully hints, and it's unpacked more as well in the introduction, that these women, of course, are charismatic in various ways, particularly when we have those we have more detail about, and those who actually asserted their claim to power the last 4 chapters of the book. Nonetheless, she acknowledges very clearly that all of them enjoyed their authority at least partly by virtue of dynastic ties, and that extends to the modern period as well. Benazir Bhutto, of course, being the daughter of Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto, and kind of sign of this Sindhi, she calls feudal dynasty, if you like, and Megawati Sukarno Putri, the daughter of Sukarno, the independence leader and first premier of Indonesia, and it's true of the others as well in a variety of ways. Queen Arwa's paternal uncle, if I'm not mistaken, had kind of consolidated his rule over the Yemen and recognized her. So one important thing to point out is, yes, it's true, there's no denying or escaping the fact that their closeness to power is a function of their belonging to these elite families. But their coming to power, and of course she stresses the agency of these figures, their coming to power is by no means a foregone conclusion, quite the opposite. When it comes to Benazir Bhutto, for instance, her brother, Mir Murtaza, really regarded himself as the rightful inheritor of their father's legacy. So in the jockeying and jostling for power, and I have to say, and I'm going to bring my own opinion to this, in the very sordid and tawdry struggle for dominance, an opportunity, they have to make a case for their rule, they have to defeat their rivals, and so on, whether that's in the modern period, which in the context of this routinization of, well, not charisma, but of succession, in this case, as she describes it, or indeed in the pre-modern context, where it would involve actual plotting and scheming and assassination, although that Benazir Bhutto...
It's interesting, actually. It's interesting that dimension does actually sort of feature, I, of course, in these conversations, I'm the one who's usually sort of asking you about the book, but I try to read sort of from the book, and I read the introduction in the first chapter. And in the introduction in particular, it does, that sort of what you've described as the more sordid dimension of dynastic struggles are treated, in some detail. And one other thing to highlight is she's taken 6 examples who are very prominent, very interesting, but she points out that of course there are dozens and dozens of cases where women, whether as regents, whether as in a sense being in power, even if for relatively short periods of time, are recognized in that way.
She points to examples in actually in the 17th century, you have a string of, I think, four female rulers, and as you say, many women, as in the Ottoman context, as valid as sultans, exercised authority as a kind of eminence, Greece is by virtue.
And I mean, one even thinks of the person who's seen by modern historians as perhaps the greatest Mughal emperor. A lot of these people would have come to the throne fairly early in their lives, and they would have had to basically be taken care of by a regent, who's usually a woman, usually their mother.
Absolutely.
So,
and Queen Arwa of Yemen ruled in total, much of it as de facto ruler, of course, for 71 years, which is an astoundingly long reign. And most of the figures she looks at, of course, Bilqis is a more complex question.
Right.
The queens she looks at tended to have very brief reigns. So Razia Sultan reigned in 1236. So a very brief reign. Purandocht, of course, not an unforgettable queen of Islam per se, but still a reign that was rather brief. She does make a number of general observations that I think are very helpful to us thinking historically. So, for instance, the Turco-Mongol tradition of rule and that political culture was generally much more open to the prospect of female rulers. All of the, certainly Razia Sultan and Queen Arwa, not Queen Arwa, but Razia Sultan comes from this genealogy and this tradition of politics.
I think there's also, one thing, because we're talking history here, but one thing to point out, and she mentions this in the introduction, that she's really an anthropologist, and in a sense, she's building on the scholarship of, people in adjacent disciplines. And so in a sense, people shouldn't necessarily come to this book in search of, historical research of the kind that they might expect, because she's very often dealing with texts, and this is perhaps something we can go into in a discussion, the merits of this, so to speak, that would not necessarily be seen even within the Islamic tradition, for example, when she's talking about, the way she deals with the exegetical reports about Bilqis. They're not necessarily seen as, history in a sense that this is what happened, but rather in a sense, I'm not sure how best to describe it. Myth sounds a bit derogatory.
But there are many kinds of doing history, of course. So Nietzsche has his famous essay on the uses and abuses of history, and he talks about monumental history and other kinds of history. And we've touched on this theme in previous conversations, where we talk about this kind of Rankian vision of history as history in the archive, and it has to be based on state papers and this sort of thing. So yes, there is that to bear in mind. But with Bilqis, for instance, the key thing is seeing how she is remembered by Muslims. So Bilqis is a curious figure because, as she notes rightly in the book, the Quran does not, at least apparently, does not seem to reflect negatively on her rule in any sense. And in many respects, she does ask, why is it that she hasn't been more universally appropriated as this figure of emulation by Muslim feminist scholars, which is a good question. But she does point this out, and the figure of Bilqis prompted a kind of exegetical difficulties for many in the tradition, in the sense that they did have to recognize her. She does clearly demonstrate the kinds of virtues one would expect in a Muslim sovereign. She consults her advisors before deciding what to do with Solomon's letter, and so on. And she's very tactful. She wishes to avert harm from her people. إن الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية, etc. Yes, precisely. So she does demonstrate the virtues that one would hope to find in a Muslim sovereign. Of course, in that period of her life, she is not a Muslim. But so actually, since she draws on the work of famous book of Jacob Lassner, demonizing the Queen of Sheba, there are interesting parallels between the Jewish and Islamic kind of extra scriptural portrayals and narratives about her. And she becomes, well, she is praised for certain kinds of virtues, but still seen as somehow challenging the male order. So the fact that Solomon subjugates her and in most narratives marries her is seen as, if you like, a happy ending, because the
male domination is reasserted by the end of it. Right.
Precisely. So in some narratives he marries her, and others he marries her to a companion of his and so on. So that kind of threatening element of the narrative is tamed, at least extra-Quranically.
I mean, this is one dimension which, I, of course, and I mentioned this a lot in past episodes, so I wear two hats. I'm an academic at the University of Oxford, and I'm also trained as an alim, mainly under the tutelage of a scholar called Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi of the As-Salam Institute. So, in the tradition of Nadwatul Ulama, I have an alimiyya, so to speak. And so I wear the sort of like Western social scientist perspective as a historian, as it were, that she comes with. But I also wear the hat of someone who's thinking theologically. Some of these questions are very interesting and in many respects quite challenging that she raises. And I wish, obviously she's coming as a social scientist, and everyone brings their own expectations to a book, and I can't expect her to engage theologically on these sorts of questions, right? But I think that there's a lot of there's a great opportunity in discussing a book like this to think about categories like sexism, like patriarchy, and to a certain extent, I mentioned the historical dimension. I think I may have mentioned in passing the hadith that she sort of refers to and repeatedly refers to as the alleged report from the Prophet. Exploring that historically and theologically would have been something I would have loved to see. But of course, that's something which I, as a theologian, should engage in rather than sort of expecting.
But I should say, in her ethnohistory, if you like, of each of these six figures, particularly exploring the kind of opposition they brooked and they faced, and if this opposition can be construed in a religious sense. So, she does indicate that and it's an interesting point that, at least in the sources she read, this hadith is not always invoked. So, for instance, in the case of Queen Arwa, it is not, it seems there are not many sources on her. Of course, she talks about these two key Ismaili histories. For Queen Arwa, and even for some of these others, one doesn't get a sense that opposition to them was mobilized along lines of sex or with reference to religious arguments about the inability of women to rule or the inadequacy. So all of them actually were, in their various ways, of course, we're dependent on our sources, the pre-modern examples, were popular. Certainly in the case of the two modern examples, these were democratically elected and enjoyed almost, certainly Benazir Bhutto, especially a kind of cult following. And this is a function really of their charisma. She does make the point that sometimes, at least, women do style themselves, and this is very explicitly the case with Megawati Sukarno Putri as kind of mothers of the nation, and that they have a kind of softer touch, if you like, and this is a cause of their popularity. But even Queen Arwa and to a lesser extent Razi Sultan did enjoy popular support, as far as we can tell.
And the reality is that, I mean, we speak about democratic legitimacy in the modern period, but I think historically you needed to have, a type of popular legitimacy which is, far less sort of like, in a sense, easy to designate and identify as a historical sort of category. But, if you're wildly unpopular, the equivalent of the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd will probably do something about you. Not just in the Muslim context, but even in a place like feudal Europe, there will be, if you're sort of not enjoying the support of the people who really, it's not necessarily the the lower classes or of society, but I think that kind of popular, I think we have a myth about pre-modern societies that these were absolute autocracies, that I think all societies have to have a bit of give and take between the ruled and the ruled and the ruling class.
Yes, it's a tricky question. I mean, I would say one point that ought to be made about many of the figures studied, not all of them, is they enjoyed access to power by means of their dynastic connections.
Right.
And, if you have a problem with that, then that does mitigate, to some extent, the sense in which one can adopt them as people worthy of emulation. I'm all for celebrating one's achievements and attainments.
Right.
But those attainments have to be deserving of celebration in the first place. So if you think of really nearly any of these rulers,
right,
with the exception of Aisha, who is not a ruler, of course, radiallahu anha,
right,
the approach to power, or the view of power, even among the modern world, certainly among Bhutto and her clan, is basically a patrimonial one.
Right.
The state is there for you to fleece, and power is something you gain, and you can then give out patronage to your followers. And of course, this was, of course, the norm. Certainly among
I think that's important to bear in mind that in a lot of societies, unfortunately, and this sort of really runs up against our modern sensibilities. But I think scholars like David de Cosimo and others who talk about sort of early Muslim, even Michael Cook, about early Muslim republicanism, so to speak.
So there's this very entrenched opposition to monarchy. One finds certainly in this very pronounced in the early Sunni tradition.
In the early Sunni tradition, of course, later on, it basically, it's a fait accompli, and it's very difficult to dislodge in a sense. It's only in sort of the modern period, I think, you have these reimaginings with people like Maududi and Qutb and others who, and that's, I mean, so I wouldn't set too much store by sort of that sort of being a failing, so to speak. Because
Arwa,
as historians, we kind of,
I should say, Queen Arwa receives as her dower a year's revenue from the city of Aden. I mean, was this her father's money that she was? I don't know. Anyway.
No, I mean, so this. I mean,
point.
In many respects, I think legal scholars in the Islamic tradition would recognize that, and my father writes about this very eloquently. I think that, look, this is not your money, and it's actually misappropriated wealth in many respects, and this is why, in a sense, there is this sort of embedded challenge with it. There's this tension, obviously, that runs through the Islamic history in the post kind of normative period, so to speak. That we can talk about, I think, a lot more easily in our own time, because we have all of these other possibilities that we were able to witness, so to speak, which have their own problems. I mean, you spoke about, you in a sense alluded to the concept of meritocracy, and there is a lot of, I think, rigorous philosophical criticism of meritocracy's problems as well. So, and whether even genuine meritocracy exists. A lot of things are, and to a certain extent, we can go back to even like hadith like الناس معادن كمعادن الذهب والفضة خيركم في الجاهلية خيركم في Islam. Those sorts of things are in many respects heritable traits, and it's like another hadith. Sorry, I'm just going to go off on another one, but you have the ذهب أهل الدثور بالأجور, and then in certain versions of the hadith the Prophet ﷺ says ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء. So
True.
I mean that's
to cite
that's not a justification.
very different authority. I mean, the great Thomas Paine said that he'd never heard of a hereditary professor of mathematics, which is true.
Right.
But I mean, to focus more on the book, she has put a lot of thought into which rulers she has selected. So they all do have certain virtues beyond just political acumen. So whether it's Queen Arwa, for instance, who in the Ismaili hierarchy occupied the rank of Hujjah, which is the second below that of Imam, and played a key role in the religious history of the Tayyibi Ismaili da'wah. And she was very learned. Her paternal uncle, not maternal uncle, sorry, had ensured that she received an excellent education. So many of these figures, I mean, in the case of Queen Arwa, she actually enjoyed considerable religious authority. She was recognized in her office and in her political responsibilities by the Fatimid Caliph. So and others like Razia and so on endowed Madaris and so on. So they were also patrons of learning. It's not simply that they deserve to be, or my sense at least of the book is that Shahla Haeri is not claiming that their achievements deserve to be celebrated. The mere fact of their occupying political office or executive office is not the only thing that is interesting or fascinating about them.
Right.
But it is really how they used it and how they expressed their authority and what kinds of opposition this met with.
Right. I mean, there's another sort of aspect of this. So, as with all the books that we deal with, there are so many dimensions that we could address. And, there's a saying that book reviews tell you more about the review than the reviewed, right? Because we're reflecting on what really strikes our attention, or, strikes us as worthy of attention, as it were. But what I wanted to sort of, if it's not too self-indulgent of me, so to speak, and I just want to acknowledge also various questions coming in. Thank you so much. Wa alaikum salam, Sana Awan. But we will try and deal with these in the last 15 to 20 minutes, inshallah, as well as we can. Sure. I wanted to, in a sense, home in on a couple of themes that come up in the book, which I found quite challenging in many respects, given my sort of, training as an alim as well. And, these are, I think, very important issues that Muslim scholars who are in, the confessional tradition, in a sense, theologians, fuqaha, and so on, need to grapple with and think about, because they do reflect, I think, a prevailing normativity that is global now, right? This is basically, we live in a globalized Western modernity of a sort, which has very strong normative claims on all of us. It makes very strong normative claims. So, for example, I wanted to sort of briefly discuss the notion of patriarchy. Now, I want to preface this by pointing out that, I acknowledge that we're both men here discussing the book of a very eminent gender studies scholar, a woman who was the sort of head of the Center for Gender Studies at Boston University for much of her career. So, I recognize my own positionality in that regard. And hopefully, this can be a dialogue, the beginning of discussion and a dialogue on these sorts of issues. And I hope it's, gender is an area, Omar, where you're far, better equipped in terms of reading the secondary literature than I am. So, I make tentative first steps here. All that preface aside, so the question of patriarchy and also the question of, what do Muslims do about hadiths like this? How have modern Muslims dealt with these sorts of questions? And a lot of very interesting modern responses that I didn't read far enough to see, to what extent she engaged them. And finally, so the question of the actual hadith, but also the question of, how should a scholar, including sort of, for example, an anthropologist writing in the West, deal with that sort of a hadith in as much as I found a bit sort of uncomfortable constantly reading it as alleged hadith, where in my estimation there wasn't really sort of enough historical analysis of the hadith. So
or something like you said, meta-analysis or something like that.
Islamicate meta-analysis would have been very interesting, and also
I mean, ultimately, I suppose
recognizing recognizing the sort of very varied sort of levels of authenticity in the tradition. So it's not sort of I felt the tradition was a little flattened when we're dealing with the alleged hadith, so to speak, but then Tha'alibi's tafsir, which is full of Isra'iliyat, all of these
Aras al-Majala specifically, not his tafsir.
Right, sorry.
So,
and these sorts of reports, forgive me, the tafsir literature on these are, they are very heavily influenced, obviously, by the sort of pre-Islamic traditions on these sorts of questions, and so they're not per se normative. I remember reading, for example, Suyuti quotes this, story about Bilqis raising her gown so that she could step on what she thought was water, and she quotes the sort of the tafsir, which is tradition that is narrated, and the modern editor basically says this is Israeli and it's batil, right? And just puts in a footnote. And so there's this interesting question in the modern period: how do modern Muslims deal with these sorts of reports? They don't actually accept a lot of them, but they do accept, for example, the hadith that she's labeled as alleged. That's
yes.
No one really disputes the authenticity of
question.
that.
Yeah.
In the Sunni, Sorry, just a series of questions. I just thought I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these questions.
Yeah. So for me, I think. So the book asks excellent questions, but they're slightly different questions. And for me, although the question of in what sense are these reports about Bilqis normative or not is a fascinating one. For most pre-modern Muslims, I imagine, even for those involved in the tafsir enterprise, these kinds of reports are constitutive of the tradition. So. We may not agree, and I imagine we don't agree with this particular depiction of Bilqis, but for most pre-modern Muslims, something like this would have been recognizable. And in a sense, because she's interested in exploring the challenges that female rulers faced and how this opposition expressed itself, specifically whether it did so in a kind of religious vein, the question of the hadith's authenticity or authoritativeness or not can kind of be bracketed. The question then becomes, is this hadith being invoked? And what effects does it have? So she says, for instance, in 1988, members of Islami file with the Lahore High Court a case or a suit that is promptly dismissed, saying that, well, she cannot rule because she's a woman and we have this hadith. And I think she does quite a good job of skewering, of highlighting, skewering and highlighting at the same time, if you like, the way that this hadith is often invoked in extremely opportunistic ways. So including whether Megawati Sukarnoputri, who some of her staunchest opponents then become members of her cabinet or members of her governing coalition, having previously insisted that women were not capable of serving, and even kind of people who have a history of supporting the cause of gender equality, like Abdurrahman Wahid, kind of seemingly opportunistically going against this long-standing commitment. And similarly with Benazir Bhutto, who is depicted as kind of cultivating Fazlur Rahman, not the famous Chicago University intellectual, but Maulana Fazlur Rahman, aka Mullah Diesel, cultivating him as a kind of pet almost. Now, if you look at the 20th century, of course, and she mentions the case of Maududi supporting, the Jama'ati Islami certainly. Supporting.
It was Maududi himself,
Yes, supporting Maududi Fatima Jinnah against Ayub Khan. Our colleague Salman Yunus has an excellent book chapter on Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Indira Gandhi. And his argument is kind of a more principled one, less to do with kind of realpolitik than the idea that, well, modern heads of state are not, do not enjoy untrammeled executive authority, and they are restrained in all kinds of ways by modern institutions like parliaments and legislative bodies and so on. So that's interesting. So even those who would support the hadith or as authentic, for instance, then have to have a further discussion about its application, which is a related but separate discussion. And you can think even, I don't recall off the top of my head how Hamid al-Ghazali felt about the report, but I recall he was a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher. And I should say, just to end this comment, I'm just down the road from St. Giles Cathedral, where John Knox, the famous reform or theologian in the Reformed tradition, preached, including against female rule. His famous book, The Monster Against the Monstrous Regiment, as he called it, of women. So we see this kind of opposition figures in multiple religious traditions. It's in no sense distinct to Muslim.
But I think, yes, in many respects, there has been the transformation in the way in which, in a sense, this hadith has been seen as a mushkil, so to speak. It's mushkilul hadith in a way that wouldn't have been mushkil hadith in that category, so to speak, in the pre-modern tradition. And I think you mentioned Muhammad al-Ghazali. You can mention Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a student of al-Ghazali, who basically has the same opinion. Again, Qaradawi certainly doesn't impugn the authenticity of the report, but he points to the context. And the context in the Sahih Bukhari report is quite sort of like it's part of the hadith. It's basically saying, in the case of the sort of Iran or Persia at the time was going through really serious problems with dynastic succession. They had God knows how many sort of like successive sovereigns, so to speak,
so
in the space of 10 years.
Brother and husband murdered Khusra and Anushirvan, and then her sister was murdered. And very messy, sordid.
Very, very messy situation. And of course, it sort of like presaged the end of the empire. But in that context, even though the wording seems very general, لَنْ يُفْلِحَ قَوْمٌ وَلَّوْ أَمْرَهُمْ امْرَأَةً.
And then in summary way as la, as she points out in the book. La, in some variants of the reports he mentions in the book, the wording is la, as opposed to la, which is less categorical, you could say.
Which is less, yes, I suppose. And but I think, again, this is really a question of how do Muslims engage a tradition. And the tradition, as exemplified by someone like Qaradawi or al-Ghazali, and Qaradawi is usually a lot more sort of, Ghazali had his he might have been a bit, some hadith scholars might describe him as a bit cavalier with hadith, so to speak. And this was a critique that was leveled towards him by a lot of Salafis. Qaradawi is a little more sort of concerned about showing deference to the canon, to the tradition, but engaging in usuli sort of like workarounds, so to speak, and in a way that is more likely to be sort of satisfactory to people who are traditionally minded, so to speak. And so, I personally, reading here, and they talk about Margaret Thatcher, I think it's a little unfair to describe Ghazali as an admirer of Margaret Thatcher, but they talk about the way in which she was
very strong. It's
ironic. He is a very strong leader.
Yes, very strong.
I believe it was
extremely divisive, of course, especially.
Of course. She basically was forced out by her colleagues. She didn't believe in consensus leadership, but that's slightly beyond the point, of course. Just to drive the point home, they both also talk about Golda Meir, right? The Israeli sort of head of state, and talking about, well, all of these Muslim male heads of state have failed against the Israeli head of state. Yeah. What does that say? And using history in a sense to contextualize a hadith, both in the original context of the hadith as it's reported in Bukhari, and in the context of the modern period. And that's, I think, a fairly, it's not something that pre-modern authors really thought to consider a problem.
Yes.
But it is, in the modern period, it's like, it's a way which both preserves their sort of respect for the tradition, or at least someone like al-Qaradawi, and for the Prophet, but also tries to find this midpoint between those two in terms of the tradition and dealing with the modern context.
So she does actually explore some of these ideas in the introduction. She mentions at least once the hadith is ahead of solitary in its transmission.
Right.
And she points to variants, for instance, and says that it may not have been categorical, and cites Nabiya Abbott as saying that, the Prophet ﷺ is unlikely to have expressed such sentiments because we know that he took the advice of his wives very seriously, for instance, and so on. So she does engage in these discussions, but ultimately it's not her focus, and this is not the purpose of the book. Now,
yes, no, I should acknowledge this, that I'm just making a comment on, as I say, as a sort of using the book as a springboard to think about and reflect on a question, because as part of this sort of review series, one of the things that I'm trying to get out of it is to think about questions from a normative theological sort of perspective. And I'm really grateful that the book has offered me this opportunity to reflect on this particular question.
Yes, and I see the book, and I kind of commend it to readers as an opportunity to reflect not only on what these questions and this hadith in particular mean for them personally, but also how it has figured in the reigns of these particular powerful figures. What role has have religious norms played in their opposition to them, for instance? So it's a very kind of illuminating series of portraits.
I also sort of wanted to use the book as an opportunity to reflect on the question of patriarchy. And this is, again, it's a challenge, I think, for the normative tradition to think about, because patriarchy is very clearly in the sort of the modern imaginary, or I think overwhelmingly it's a negative idea, and sometimes it's rendered as a substantive, the patriarchy, right? And I wonder, like, the challenge that arises for Muslims in the modern world, and this I think is a challenge, to be honest, equally for Muslim men and women, reflective Muslim men and women, so to speak, if that's perhaps a little bit uncharitable, so to speak, but in the sense that if we assume that pre-modern society was patriarchal, absolutely, and a lot of the tradition is portrayed in Shahla Haeri's book as basically being just suffused with this very problematic patriarchy, which he, in a sense, tries to absolve the Prophet of by repeatedly referring to this hadith as alleged, right? But in many respects, I think, for within the Sunni tradition, as we've already discussed, this is considered a canonical hadith. And this is not just, one. There are so many hadiths that discuss, the sort of the question of gender, and in ways that would be viewed as very patriarchal to many with modern sensibilities. And so I think there's that, this is a challenge of competing normativities in my estimation. And I think that's something which really comes out to me from this book as a sort of like a Muslim reader who's interested in those sorts of questions of tradition, that, it's fine to sort of accept as a norm that these societies were basically patriarchal in the pre-modern tradition. But if we take patriarchy as a disparaging label, patriarchal as a disparaging label, and we recognize that actually the Prophet ﷺ was himself engaged in these sorts of norms, and these sorts, and was in a society where he affirmed and legitimized various norms that modern sort of Westerners would consider patriarchal, then you have this problem of trying to square the circle. So you end up in a situation where there needs to be a conversation. Otherwise, you either will say that, you can't, those aren't views that can be held in the same mind simultaneously, shall we say?
Yes, I'm just thinking. So
and that's my take on it.
Many points in the book kind of come to mind. So she talks, even when you're thinking of a patriarchal context, which all of these women have dealt with in various ways that she discusses, it is not monolithic. So it does not, that is not to say that all men subjugate all women in equal ways. It's a kind of a complex, multi-layered reality.
Absolutely.
And certain women are able to leverage, elements of that patriarchy, being attached to a powerful male.
Right.
But in the book, she's really interested in, within these patriarchal constraints,
yes,
how exactly do they assert their agency? And for me, these kinds of questions give rise to the most interesting scholarship about gender. For instance, Yossi Rappaport's book on money, marriage, and divorce. So within a patriarchal context, how is it exactly that women are able to assert themselves?
Right.
While I'm not even necessarily in all cases subverting this kind of constraint, the assumptions of the society in which they operate.
Working within them.
Yeah. So
and in some sense affirming them by working within them.
Yes. So one suggestion she has, it's a fairly tentative one, is that based on the claim that this hadith enjoys greater currency in the modern period, ironically, is that pre-modern Muslims may not have felt so threatened by the ascent to power of particular females because it did not undermine the patriarchal system as a whole. It did not challenge it. Whereas now, when feminism is a kind of mass movement and has kind of very broad and deep impacts on society, men feel somewhat more challenged, by rulers like Benazir Bhutto and so on. I'm aware we're coming towards the last quarter hour, so we should probably...
We are, so we should really deal and give people the opportunity to address their questions. So, Barakallah Feekum, Omar. I mean, this is always sort of very interesting and beneficial, these conversations. So I want to thank you first. And then I'm going to go first to Aisha Said's question. I'm going to go in order. So these were questions asked actually a while ago now.
On the screen as well?
Absolutely. So I'm going to just read it out for the benefit of those listening on the podcast. And for your information, alhamdulillah, we're now on iTunes as well. So inshallah, I'll be uploading these videos very soon, inshallah, as podcasts on iTunes. So Aisha Said asks, she comments, very interesting topic of the book. Please excuse my not having read it. Does the book talk about how strong and autonomous these women in power were or were not in reality, given most of them were ruling male-dominant patriarchal societies? Right. And I think we've kind of touched on some of this, but
so of course there are constraints on their power, and to a great extent their power is, it's a combination of several factors. One, their dynastic connections in all of these cases. And secondly, their own personal charisma and political nous. So I know someone like Queen Arwa, for instance, the subject of the third chapter, did enjoy genuine power. She was queen and de facto ruler for a total of 71 years. She played a major role in, if you like, she was somewhat autonomous, I should say, and she also helped to kind of, towards the end of her reign, distance the Sulayhids of the Yemen from the Fatimids. Now, power is always negotiated in various ways. And as good Foucauldians, we should recognize that power is ubiquitous. But I mean, a number of them, they did exercise power within the constraints of patriarchal societies, and also within the constraints of dynastic politics. For much of her career, Benazir Bhutto was fending off her brother Mir Murtaza, and even her mother, who turned against her, who, in the interest, you could say, out of patriarchal considerations, actually supported her brother's right to the political mantle
That's actually,
of
I mean,
Zulfikar.
that's an interesting point
Yes.
that is made often by gender scholars. There's often the women who are basically there to police the patriarchal norms.
It's part of what the scholar Dennis Candiotis referred to as the patriarchal bargain. So patriarchy, of course, does offer women something in return, and in return they have to uphold its kind of standards and enforce them. My eye is drawn to, although it's not in order, Shir Ali Tareen's, and I wonder if I can tie this question to Aisha Sayyid's question.
Feel free. So I'm just going to read out his question. And first, I'll read out his very kind comment. He says, "This is a delightfully nerdy podcast, by the way. Great work, you both."
That's very
fun. And his question is, wondering what qualifies as a queen for the author. I noticed a chapter devoted to Benazir Bhutto, who, while tragically killed young, was by most accounts a ferociously corrupt politician.
Yes.
Puzzling.
And if we could bring up Aisha Sayyid's, which is closely related also on Bhutto.
Right. So I mean, your references to Benazir Bhutto are interesting. I'll just read it out for the podcast, inshallah. Aisha Sayyid points out, your references to Bhutto are interesting. Leading a country like Pakistan after the most conservative regime was most challenging. The seeming power had so many dimensions that remain hidden. The seeming quote power, she put. Yeah.
Yes. And it's something we find in other contexts. Haeri, who, by the way, has conducted many interviews with close friends and associates of Benazir Bhutto, so she's very well informed about this.
Right.
Says that in the Sindhi context, the elder son is often almost feared by the father, and in pre-modern context, there's also suspicion towards the eldest, a son or the eldest son, and there's no primogeniture, of course. Is often mirrored. So it's no surprise that rulers are often quite emotionally close to their daughters because they may not feel as threatened by them, politically speaking. Now, she does acknowledge, in response to Shir, it would be hard not to acknowledge the corruption, although in the book she emphasizes several times that she's not actually going to be exploring the policies of any of these rulers in depth.
Right.
She does acknowledge, citing interviews, that, well, one of her interviewees says that things really go downhill for Benazir when she grants her husband, Asif Ali Zawahiri, quite extensive authority and a sort of ministerial portfolio, and that's when things really go downhill. I mean, speaking personally, I don't hold her out as a great model to be emulated for men or for women. But
she doesn't buck the trend, shall we say, of Muslim world leaders in the modern period.
Yes, which is tragic. I mean, again, she is the sign of this landed family, which I should say Haeri repeatedly describes or characterizes as feudal. But nonetheless, I mean, even though we may not admire her moral qualities, I certainly do not. Or even in certain respects, her leadership, you can't doubt her political acumen.
Right.
She overcame
and her popularity as well.
Of course, she overcame tremendous challenges.
For better or for worse.
Yes, for better or for worse, indeed. So she is an interesting choice, mired in corruption and so on. So that is really acknowledged in various ways by the author.
Right. I'm a little conscious of time. I just want to read out. So Samina Awan has a relatively brief question. Do these women in Muslim history, or are they ever considered wise or brave? She puts in inverted quotes. Just by virtue of being rulers, so to speak.
Yeah. So again, she's chosen the figures she looks at in the book quite carefully. So. All of them are, well, not all of them are rulers, but those who are rulers are not just conspicuous by fact of their being in power. I mean, there are other figures who could have pointed to, the queens of Aceh, the various begums of Bhopal in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right.
But they are in various ways distinctive or noteworthy. Queen Arwa and Razia Sultan were very popular. Right. As with Sukarno Putri and Bhutto. And I mean, there is a discussion of their achievements as well. And their coming to power itself means something, is meaningful, because in order to do so, in order to climb the greasy pole, so to speak, they are confronted by challenges that their male peers do not face. So their coming to power in itself is a demonstration of agency and political acumen.
Right.
I see Rabi' al-Khatib's question.
Right.
So
He adds a comment, I think.
Yes,
he basically says the hadith was narrated before the Battle of al-Jamal and deterring people, and was used to deter people from joining me and Aisha.
Yes.
And the narrator said, recalling it benefited him. So it's narrated by Abu Bakr. This is a sort of, this is one of the points which I think in the modern period has been raised, notably by Fatima Marnisi, of course, a sort of, pointing out that Abu Bakr was actually mahdudun bil-qadf or something like this.
So he was punished. More complicated than this.
But it's more complicated than that, of course, yes.
Of course.
And the thing is, I mean, when it comes to riwayah, that's a different question to shahada and qada, etc. But it's, Jonathan Brown giving Marnisi due credit points out that, it's quite an ingenious argument in a way. Yes. But yes, I think, that point is recognized by scholars of hadith, and it doesn't impugn him as a rawi, according to the scholars of hadith historically.
Yes, but the hadith is recalled in a political context.
Right.
Rabi' is very right to point this out. So
right.
Aisha is trying to, if you like, rally people to her cause, and she goes to Basra, where Abu Bakr is based, and he recalls this hadith in that context. So this is why he does not join her cause.
But it's fascinating as well. I mean, people very often forget that riwayah of hadith very often takes place in that sort of a historically situated context.
And I should point out that Haeri says there's no evidence that Aisha's very considerable following was deterred by this hadith from taking up swords and joining her and Talha and Zubair. Right. That's another point worth bearing in mind. In all of these cases, even where the hadith is invoked, it does not prevent these women from exercising political
the
power,
reality
coming to power, enjoying popularity either.
Absolutely. The reality of a figure like Aisha in particular is that she's a faqihah, and she is engaging in her own ijtihad, and this is why I like to sort of highlight again, we've mentioned this book before, but Muhammad Akram Nadwi, my own in sort of fiqh and hadith, has just published a book in 43 volumes that compiles the biographical dictionary. It's a biographical dictionary of female hadith scholars.
Al-Wafa bi Asma' al-Nisa, right?
Al-Wafa bi Asma' al-Nisa. And, various scholars, Suyuti, Zarkashi, wrote collections of istidrakat Aisha ala Sa'ir al-Sahaba, or I don't recall the exact title, but
thesis now on Zarkashi's book on this subject.
Right. The corrections of Aisha of other, scholarly Sahaba on various questions of fiqh on the basis of her knowledge and proximity from the Prophet ﷺ. And Shaykh Akram has actually expanded, the two previous works to incorporate a much larger corpus, as far as I understand, of her corrections.
Haeri says that her personality, Aisha's personality, emerges very clearly in the sources.
And so Abu Bakr, forgive me if I just make this one final point. Abu Bakr is engaged in a kind of ijtihad on the basis of that hadith, and Aisha rejected, basically, right? Although the later Sunni tradition presents her as recognizing she was mistaken in going out, but I'm not sure, and I'm not as well read on this as you, Omar. I'm not sure she ever sort of questioned her right to engage in the public sphere, as a, in a sense, an authority figure, because she, in a sense, continued to exercise that authority, maybe not as a prominent political figure, but as a scholarly figure, by engaging in riwayah for the rest of her life.
So Haeri points out, drawing especially on the well-known book of Denise Spielberg on Aisha,
Right. Right.
that you have, of course, reports where she's said to have regretted her action later, and certain companions rebuked her for taking up arms. But there is one incident Haeri discusses where she hears the foreboding sound of the barking of the dogs of al-Hawab and is persuaded nonetheless to continue.
Right.
So there is that.
Right. Right. But again, that's a context of specifically this fitna, right? It's not really a comment on the question of whether women wield authority in the public sphere. And what I'm in a sense arguing is, by her teaching and actually narrating a vast number of hadiths, she's one of them, mukthirin almost. I think she's counts as one of the mukthirin as far as I recall. The 4 or 5 people who narrated more than anyone else. And in her, that's a public role. That's what I'm arguing in a sense. She is a public scholarly authority, and she's a faqih, and in that capacity, So that's never in question.
Is diverse, and Haeri mentions in the book, well, certainly her knowledge of ilm al-fara'id and poetry. Right. She was an authority in these fields, among others.
We have one last question, I suppose. Sure. Let me read it out, if that's all right. The book seems to view political rule as a source of celebration. This is from Jan Islam. So, but then he asks, how does the author negotiate between the inevitable questions of oppression and authoritarianism that define, especially modern polities? How does the author negotiate between the so-called achievement of political rule and the actual problems arising from unjust systems of rule? That's an interesting
a very good question.
Yeah, very, very good question.
And she does not. She stresses on a couple of occasions. She's not delving into the policies of any of these figures. She says other people have done that, and if you like, you can go and read those books. But she is interested in highlighting through this frame of ethnohistory the kinds of challenges women faced, how they overcame those challenges through the exercise of their agency. So one could point out that it's almost as if the achievement or attainment of political power is being celebrated in itself. I don't think that's quite the case.
I don't think that's the purpose.
But it's not, as you say, not the purpose of the book.
Yeah.
And we have our own opinions about.
And the other thing I'd point out, if I may, is that people write about terrible male public figures all the time, and I was just thinking about in Oxford, for example, we're having this debate mainly at Oriel College, of course, with the statue of Cecil Rhodes. Prominently figuring on the sort of front facade of the college, very high up, and in a sense symbolizing for a lot of people of color, so to speak, their subordinate status. They walk under him every single day, right? And literally. And so but there are so many sort of paeans written to him, some of which are written by eminent historians going into nearly 1,000 pages, so to speak. And I think, I don't sort of begrudge this author the opportunity to write, about these people, even if I have my own sort of theological perspectives on these sorts of questions, and also political reservations, so to speak.
And in the very beginning of the book, she talks about, of course, women's kind of increasing prominence and challenge to patriarchal structures and ideas. Part of that challenge is just retrieving these stories, retrieving these accounts, otherwise neglected. I mean, many people will have never heard, unless you live in South Asia, will not have heard of Razia, Sultan of Delhi, or Queen Arwa of Yemen. Some of these have come to prominence, especially figures like Queen Arwa, and she talks about Tawakkul Karman and so on, because they are appropriated by female activists in different contexts as tokens, if you like, or symbols of female empowerment. But part of the struggle of feminist historiography is just retrieving these stories that are often neglected. Someone like Queen Arwa, whose details are not recorded in a great many chronicles, for instance. So there is that to bear in mind.
Right. I'm very conscious. We've actually, I mean, this has been a really fascinating sort of topic of discussion.
And thank you for your excellent
book
questions, of course.
And we thank all of the participants really for making this a very lively discussion as well. We, of course, have gone over, this is the longest session we've had, actually, gone over quite a bit. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to briefly introduce next week's book, and then,
sure.
Then we'll wrap up.
So I have not yet received my physical copy. The publishers have sent me a digital copy, but I'm sure you'll all be as excited as I am by next week's book, which is Simonetta Calderini's Women as Imams, Classical Islamic Sources and Modern Debates on Leading Prayer. Very topical subject, and a book that has been researched over many years. So very excited to read that and to discuss it next week. And I should end
really
by
elicit
thanking. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. That book, like this one, should elicit, I hope, a lot of interest and a lot of questions and comments as well. So we look forward to that. Sorry.
Absolutely. And I mean, I should thank Shahla Haeri for her very engagingly written book, very well, provocative in the sense that it asks important questions that we should all be engaged with in various ways. And I think it's
inescapable questions. Inescapable questions that
absolutely.
We all and we're very grateful for her to bring these to our attention and force us to really grapple with them and think about them seriously.
Absolutely.
And if it's okay, I'll finally close by thanking you, Omar, for taking the time to read the book very carefully and spending over an hour with me this week, of course, to really elucidate your insights into the book and field my questions and the questions of our audience. So with that, I'd like to bid you all, inshallah, farewell, and we will see you in a week's time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.